I stood still, my suitcase handle digging into my palm as the crowd pressed around me in the terminal. The words cut clean through the noise. "Walk behind us, you look pathetic." My son didn't look back. The sliding doors hissed shut between us, sealing me out like I was excess baggage. I raised that boy, gave him my name, my years, my love. And now I wasn't even worth walking beside. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. I stood there in the crowded airport, my hands trembling around the handle of my suitcase as my son's words hit me like a slap. "Walk behind us, you look pathetic." The sting of his rejection cut through the noise of the terminal, but it wasn't the pain that lingered. It was the fire that sparked inside me. I'd carried him for 9 months, raised him for years, and now I would make him crawl when I took back everything I'd built. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The hum of the Dallas-Fort Worth airport was loud, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the distance building between them. The family trip was officially over, and now they were just 3 strangers walking side by side, only tied by blood. Scott and Dana moved ahead, their steps in sync like a pair of well-oiled gears. Marjorie's feet struggled to keep pace. Her suitcase wheels clicked, then stuttered, then clicked again. An uneven rhythm that mirrored the discomfort twisting in her gut. She tried to pull the strap of her purse tighter over her shoulder, but it slipped, and she gripped it again, fingers trembling. "Keep up, Marjorie," Dana's voice came, a taunting lilt in it. Marjorie glanced up at her, but Dana had already turned her head back, a smug look hidden beneath the subtle drop of her eyes. Scott didn't bother to glance back. He just kept walking, face fixed, as if every step was an exhale from the tension that had been building all trip long. The terminal was crowded, but in this moment, it felt like Marjorie and her family were the only ones in the world. She felt like she was a step behind, like she had been for the last few years. That empty space was constant, but now it was suffocating. She quickened her pace, but as she did, Scott's voice cracked the air. "Walk behind us. You look pathetic." The words were sharp, cold, careless. He didn't even slow down. Her heart skipped, her cheeks burning instantly. It was as if the words landed in a way they never had before, cutting through all the previous fights, all the passive-aggressive comments from Dana, all the guilt trips. This wasn't just criticism, it was venom, direct and precise. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper. He meant it. The sharp sting of humiliation lingered long after Scott's back turned. Travelers nearby glanced over, their eyes darting in Marjorie's direction. Some faces were sympathetic. Others were indifferent. But to her, it was as if the whole airport could see it, see her shrinking into the background, invisible in her own family. Dana smirked, the faintest tilt to her lips, but Marjorie caught it. It wasn't a look of victory. It was something worse. Dana knew. She'd always known. Her throat tightened as she kept walking, trying to ignore the heat spreading through her skin. Her footsteps grew heavier, each one a hammer on the floor, a reminder of how she couldn't outrun this. She had tried, she had done everything she could to make them proud, to make this family work, but no matter how hard she tried, they just ignored her. Her thoughts clouded, just for a moment, as the weight of their disinterest crashed in on her. She was nothing, to them at least. As they reached the escalator, Scott paused only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to let Marjorie's blood pressure spike. He said, without even turning his head, "Don't you dare try to catch up." His voice was a quiet command that sent a ripple through the crowd. The world shrank even more. The rush of people around her, the hum of the terminal, the low buzz of overhead announcements, it all faded. There was just the sound of her own breathing, the rhythm of her heart thumping painfully in her chest. She stopped at the bottom of the escalator, staring at the moving stairs as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. The anger, the helplessness, the need to escape all mixed together. But what was there to escape to? There was no other place, no other person. This was her reality, and it had always been. Behind her, Dana made an exaggerated noise of impatience, pushing ahead without a second thought. "Are you coming or what?" she called back, but her tone was anything but welcoming. She didn't even glance at Marjorie when she said it. Marjorie didn't move, didn't respond. She just watched the escalator climb higher and higher until it felt like the world was being pulled away from her. A voice, low and almost dismissive, echoed from the escalator above her. "You're pathetic, Marjorie. Why do you even try?" It was Scott's voice again, but this time it didn't sting. It felt like something breaking inside her, something that she had never allowed herself to admit before. She wasn't just the odd one out. She was the one they didn't care about. She looked up. Dana and Scott were already a few steps ahead, vanishing into the crowd of travelers. She could feel the pull to chase after them, to beg them to stop, to apologize for whatever it was they wanted her to apologize for. But what would be the point? They didn't see her. They never had. Without even thinking, she turned and walked in the opposite direction, away from them, away from the family that had never truly been hers. The steady beat of her own footsteps was the only sound in the terminal now, and it was the first time in years that the silence felt almost freeing. The airport seemed to stretch forever, and for once, it was okay that she was alone. The glow of the desk lamp was sharp against the creeping darkness of the room. Marjorie sat at the edge of her cluttered desk, the weight of the day pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner in the corner, struggling to keep the Texas heat at bay. She stared at the file in front of her, its crisp edges biting into her fingers as she hesitated. 118 Willow Lane, her house, her name, no one else's. She ran her thumb over the top of the manila folder, feeling the grain of the paper. The corners were bent, a sign of how many times she had gone over its contents. Every inch of it was a reminder of what she had earned, of what she had fought for. Everything she had built from the ground up, far from the hands of Scott, far from his manipulations. Her mind drifted to the conversation with Rachel earlier that week. It had been brief but sharp, cutting through her fog of self-doubt like a blade. Rachel had always been blunt, and that's what Marjorie needed. "He acts like it's his," Rachel had said, her voice tight with the frustration Marjorie had tried to ignore for years. Marjorie's throat had tightened at the words, and all she could do was nod. It wasn't just Scott's words that stung. It was his unspoken belief that he was entitled to everything Marjorie had worked for. The house, the life she had built in silence. His hands, always reaching, never content with what he had, always wanting more, not any more. The words slipped from her mouth before she could stop them. The resolve was solid now, the taste of her anger bitter and cold, like metal on her tongue. She wasn't going to allow it any longer. Scott could never have this. She would never let him take the credit for what she had made. Her hand hovered over the file. Then with deliberate force, she pulled it open. The scent of aged paper filled her nose. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Not tonight. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. The deed to the house, dated years ago when she had signed it herself, with no one's help but her own. She ran her finger over the typed address, the bold lettering of her name printed across the top of the document, her ownership, her pride. It wasn't enough just to own the house. No, she needed to remind herself that it was hers alone. Her eyes scanned the next few pages, the will, the one she'd written in the quiet moments of her life when Scott was too distracted or too self-absorbed to notice, the one that left him out, that gave him nothing but a polite nod, a cold, formal mention. She hadn't even realized the depth of her decision until now, as she saw her own signature at the bottom of the will, the weight of it sinking in. But there, on one page, Scott's name was circled. It had been a last-minute change, something she'd done in the days following another fight. She'd added him in, reluctantly, almost out of habit. Her connection to him, to that sinking feeling of blood tying her to him no matter how much she wished otherwise. She'd thought it would be right. She'd thought it would be fair. But now, looking at it, the name was an insult. Her hand shook as she reached for a pen, her grip tight. With a sharp motion, she drew a line through the circle. The ink marked the finality of the decision she had made earlier today, the one that had gnawed at her in the quiet spaces of her mind. She would change it. She would rewrite this, just as she had rewritten everything else about her life. There was no room for Scott anymore. The will could be rewritten. The house could stay, but he would never take from her again. With her eyes still focused on the page, she slammed the binder shut with a force that rattled the table. The sudden sound reverberated through the room like a gunshot, but it only settled the storm inside her. She could feel the fire rising, the heat of her resolve building in her chest. She would not back down. Not now. Not ever again. Her eyes were fixed on the closed binder, her mind racing with the possibilities. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about everything she had sacrificed for this family, for a life she no longer recognized. It was about freedom. About finally being free of Scott's voice, his presence, his ownership of her. A sound outside her door interrupted her thoughts. A faint noise, a car door slamming in the driveway. Marjorie froze, her heart stuttering in her chest. She hadn't heard anyone pull up. Her fingers twitched over the binder, a fleeting second of fear, but then she stood, shoulders squared, head held high. Let them come. As her feet carried her to the door, she knew that whatever happened next, it was no longer up to her family. The decisions were hers now, and when she opened that door, she would be read. The office smelled like fresh paper and faint coffee, sterile and untouched. A single potted plant sat in the corner, a thin strip of green trying to survive beneath the fluorescent lights. Marjorie walked in, her heels clicking across the polished floor, echoing in the empty space. Sandra's office was bright, sharp, a contrast to the darkness that had gathered around Marjorie since that morning. Sandra looked up from her desk, a soft smile spreading across her face. Her presence was calm, confident, a far cry from the chaos that had been swirling in Marjorie's head for the past few days. Sandra was the kind of person who didn't need to ask questions. She just knew. "I've got coffee, or something stronger if you need it," Sandra said, gesturing to a shelf of liquor and a modest coffee maker in the corner. "I'll take the coffee," Marjorie said, her voice hoarse from the weight of everything she hadn't been able to say to anyone. She sank into the chair across from Sandra, pulling the file out of her bag like it was a burden she could no longer carry alone. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing her inside the small office. Sandra set to work quickly, filling the coffee machine with water. Her back turned as Marjorie opened the file again, the same one she'd slammed shut the night before. She didn't want to look at the papers again, but she had to. This was the moment. Her life had to change now, or it would never. She paused, fingers on the pages, before she let out a shaky breath. "I can't believe I let him do that to me," Marjorie said, her voice tight. "The airport, he just snapped at me, like I was nothing." She shook her head, her eyes narrowing as the sting of Scott's words returned. "Like I didn't even matter." Sandra didn't look up, but Marjorie could feel her attention fully on her, steady and focused. There was no judgment in Sandra's eyes, only understanding. "You still own everything, Marjorie," Sandra said softly, setting the coffee down in front of her, the steam curling upward. Her voice was sharp now, her confidence a thread that wound tighter with each word. "He owns nothing. And it's time you stop letting him believe he does." Marjorie felt the words land with a force she hadn't expected. It was as if the world shifted for just a second, like she had been looking at everything through a cracked lens, and suddenly it was whole again. She wasn't the one in the wrong. She wasn't the one who owed anyone anything. She gripped the file tighter, her fingers digging into the manila, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. He can crawl for scraps. The words came out before she even realized she had thought them. Sandra raised an eyebrow, a slight smile playing at the corner of her lips. "You're not wrong." "No," Marjorie said, her voice lowering. "I'm not." She stood up, feeling the need to move, to breathe, to claim something for herself in this sterile office. "He's never been entitled to anything I've worked for. He doesn't even see me. He just takes, and expects." Sandra's gaze followed her, measuring her every word. "Then let him take nothing," she said firmly. "He gets what he's earned." Which is nothing. Marjorie's blood hummed in her veins, the heat of her anger beginning to settle into something more controlled, something deadly. "Then I want to make sure he gets what he deserves. The house, the will, everything he ever thought was his." Sandra leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming against the table thoughtfully. "Let's do it." The words hit Marjorie like a spark. She turned to Sandra, meeting her eyes, and the weight of it all settled onto her chest. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about every ounce of dignity she had left, every piece of herself she had fought to reclaim. This was the line. There was no going back. "Eviction paperwork," Sandra muttered, already pulling out a fresh stack of forms from her drawer. She flipped through the pages with precision, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I'll have it drafted by morning. I can get a move on it fast if you're sure." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Once that's done, Scott won't have a leg to stand on. Not legally, not financially. He'll be gone before he even knows what hit him." Marjorie didn't hesitate. The weight of the words didn't scare her anymore. The idea of losing him, of finally cutting him out of her life, felt like freedom, even if it meant chaos for a while. "I'm sure," Marjorie said, voice steady, the resolve final. Sandra smiled then, a little more to herself than to Marjorie. "Then it's done." The sound of the printer whirred to life in the corner of the room as Sandra set to work, typing swiftly, her fingers moving over the keyboard like a pianist at practice. Marjorie watched her for a moment, the quiet rhythm of it almost calming. Then, as the papers came out, Sandra turned them to face Marjorie. The bold letters across the top of the document felt almost like a promise. Eviction notice. Marjorie felt something shift inside her, something heavy and almost unbearable. But it was the good kind of weight, the kind that meant she was finally stepping into her own power. She reached for the papers, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was in control. The morning sun broke through the blinds, casting long, slanted shadows across the living room floor. Marjorie stood at the window, her fingers curling into the curtain, watching the sheriff's deputy walk up the driveway. His uniform was crisp, his gait purposeful. He had the paper in hand, the same paper she had signed just days before. The eviction notice. Her heart pounded, each beat louder than the last. She didn't need to open the door to know what was happening. She had given the instructions, signed the paperwork, and now the final act was playing out in front of her eyes. She could hear the sound of her pulse in her ears as the deputy posted the notice on the front door. The crisp sound of the tape, the deliberate way he pulled it tight across the wood, like sealing a tomb. This is it, she thought, her breath catching in her chest. The deputy stepped back, nodding once to himself, then turned and walked back down the driveway, heading to his cruiser without a glance over his shoulder. Marjorie didn't move immediately. She stood frozen, her fingers still gripping the curtain, her mind a swirl of triumph and disbelief. The truth of it still hadn't fully hit her. She heard the engine of the cruiser start, the tires crunching on the gravel as it pulled away, and then the house was silent again, the reality of what was about to happen settling in like the dust that hung in the air. A car door slammed outside, and Marjorie knew they had arrived. Scott was the first one to storm through the front door, his eyes wild, like a man who had just been pulled from a deep sleep and thrown into a nightmare. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You can't just do this, Marjorie." She turned to face him, her eyes steady, unwavering. She had known this moment was coming, had known this confrontation was inevitable, but she didn't flinch. She didn't back down. I already did, she said calmly, her voice a quiet authority that seemed to fill the room. Dana followed behind Scott, her face twisted into an expression of shock. She stopped just inside the door, eyes flicking from Marjorie to the eviction notice on the door, then back to Marjorie, as if trying to process the reality in front of her. She crossed her arms tightly, her posture defensive, as if that might somehow shield her from the truth. You wouldn't dare, Dana said, her voice low and venomous. But there was a flicker of fear in her eyes, and Marjorie knew it. She saw it. Dana had underestimated her. Marjorie didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than words could ever do. Rachel appeared in the doorway, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across her face as she observed the scene. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, enjoying the chaos unfolding in front of her. Let them worry, Rachel said, her voice smooth, almost amused. It's about time, don't you think? Marjorie glanced over at her, and Rachel's smile deepened. A wicked gleam in her eye. It was a smile of victory, of power. Behind them, the neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the sight of the sheriff's car and the eviction notice on the door. Some stood just at the edge of their lawns, others peeking through their windows. The whispers were already beginning, spreading like wildfire through the block. Scott stood there for a moment, stunned, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the words, but none came. He glanced at Dana, then back at Marjorie, but his fury was still burning in his chest, his anger bubbling beneath the surface, desperate to be unleashed. You think this is over? He spat, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you can just throw me out like this? I built this life with you. I deserve something. Marjorie stepped forward, cutting him off, her voice quiet but deadly. You deserve nothing. You get nothing, she paused, watching his face twist with the realization that she wasn't bluffing, that she had finally broken free. You've taken enough. It's time to go. Her words hung in the air, a final declaration. The reality of what she had done was hitting Scott with full force now. He knew he had lost. He knew he had nothing left to stand on. Dana's eyes narrowed, her lips twisting into a sneer. She opened her mouth to retort, but Scott held up a hand, silencing her. The fight drained from him. The neighbors were still watching, some with sympathetic glances, others with judgment. The notice on the door was a silent witness to it all, a declaration of Marjorie's independence, her final stand. Marjorie stood there, watching the chaos unravel around her. She had done it. The door was closed on that chapter of her life, and while Scott and Dana may have thought they could control her, she had shown them otherwise. She had served the notice, and now there was no going back. But even as she stood there was a part of her, deep down, that wondered if the real fight had only just begun. The court was cold, its gray walls closing in like the confines of a tomb. The air hummed with the tension of every decision yet to be made, the stakes higher than Marjorie had ever imagined. She sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the familiar weight of uncertainty settle on her chest. But now it was different. Now she was no longer the one being crushed under the weight of someone else's demands. This time, she was the one in control. The courtroom was crowded, the benches filled with onlookers, some murmuring with curiosity, others watching with the quiet anticipation of a showdown. Scott sat across from her, his hands clenched tightly in front of him, his face pale. He was leaning forward, speaking in low tones with his attorney, no doubt trying to come up with a new argument. Dana, seated next to him, had the same look of disbelief etched on her face, her arms crossed defensively. Marjorie's eyes flicked to Sandra, who sat beside her, calm as ever. A steady presence in the storm, Sandra's professionalism was like a shield, a contrast to the chaos that Scott and Dana were stirring up on the other side of the room. The judge, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze and a steady voice, called the proceedings to order. He glanced over his glasses at the pile of papers before him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Clark," the judge said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You claim that this property was promised to you?" Scott stood quickly, his voice rising with urgency. "Yes, Your Honor. My wife and I, we've built a life together, and I was promised the house, the home we made, all of it. It's only fair. I was there, I contributed. She knew what this meant to me. The house, it was always supposed to be mine." The words hung in the air, like an accusation, like something that could change the course of everything. Marjorie could feel the room shift, the whispers already starting to buzz at the edges of the room, but she kept her face neutral, her gaze fixed ahead. Sandra shifted in her seat, her hand resting on a briefcase at her side. She was ready. Marjorie could feel the weight of her trust in Sandra's every movement. "Your Honor," Sandra spoke calmly, standing up and smoothing out the wrinkles of her suit. "While Mr. Clark claims this was promised to him, the legal reality is quite different. The deed to the property, as it stands, is clear. There is no room for promises here, only facts." She pulled a folded document from the briefcase and handed it to the judge, her voice unwavering. Marjorie's heart beat faster as the judge examined the document, his fingers moving slowly over the paper as he scanned it. She could see Scott's body stiffen, his lips twitching as he watched the judge closely. The judge finally looked up, his gaze sharp. "The deed to this property," he said, turning the paper around so everyone could see, "clearly states that it belongs solely to Mrs. Clark. Mr. Clark's name is not on here. This property is, and always has been, Mrs. Clark's." A silence fell over the courtroom. It was as if the world itself had frozen in that moment. Scott's face drained of color, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if the very foundation of his world had been ripped out from beneath him. Dana let out a small gasp, her hand going to her mouth, her expression a mixture of shock and confusion. Marjorie felt a flicker of satisfaction in the pit of her stomach, but she held it back. She didn't need to gloat. Not yet. Not until the full weight of the truth had settled on them both. The judge continued, his voice steady, cutting through the quiet. "As the document indicates, there is no legal claim here from Mr. Clark. This property belongs solely to Mrs. Clark, and promises, as you've pointed out, do not pay mortgages." The words seemed to hang in the air like an echo, each syllable sinking deeper into Scott's chest. His mouth opened and closed, as if he were trying to speak, but no words came. Dana glanced at him, her face paling as the reality of the situation settled in. Marjorie stood, her movements deliberate and controlled. She took a slow step forward, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "Promises don't pay mortgages," she said, her words firm, every ounce of her resolve behind them. "And they never will." Scott's face twisted in something that might have been anger, but it was tinged with desperation now. His eyes flicked between the judge, Sandra, and Marjorie, searching for a way out, but there was none. There was nothing left to save him now. Dana, her hands trembling, shot a glare at Marjorie, but it was hollow, empty. She knew it too. There was no winning this. The judge slammed his gavel down, the sound loud and final. The courtroom now a sealed tomb for Scott's last-ditch efforts. "The decision is final," he said, his voice carrying over the hushed room. "This property belongs to Mrs. Clark, and Mr. Clark has no legal claim to it." Scott stood motionless, his hands trembling at his sides, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Dana sat back, her breath shallow, as if the air had been knocked out of her. Marjorie didn't look at them. She didn't need to. The battle was over, and for the first time in a long while, she could breathe. But even as she stood there, something gnawed at her. The twisted realization that even now, even with this victory, the real war had just begun. The house was quieter than it had been in years. The silence echoed through the empty halls, a stark contrast to the chaos that had filled every room for the past few days. But the quiet was misleading. Marjorie knew better than to think everything was settled. This was only the beginning. She stood in the living room, her eyes scanning the space that had once been her sanctuary. It had all felt so simple, so secure, but now it was as if the walls themselves had started to weep, each crack and dent a testament to what had been taken from her. Her gaze landed on the drywall, the first sign of destruction. A jagged hole, right in the center of the wall, the edges still rough and uneven. It was small, but it was enough. Enough to make her chest tighten as she walked closer. Feeling the anger start to rise again, slowly but steadily, she moved deeper into the house, each step heavier than the last. The kitchen, her kitchen, was no better. The cabinets, once pristine, now stood warped and broken. One door was hanging at an odd angle, as if it had been ripped from its hinges. She reached out, her fingers grazing the wood, and felt a hollow ache in her chest. They had destroyed this place. Marjorie swallowed hard, trying to push the surge of emotions down. She didn't have time for tears now, not when there was so much to fix, so much to rebuild. Rachel's footsteps were light behind her, the soft click of her camera filling the air. She was methodical, capturing every blemish, every mark, every sign of abuse. The lens of the camera clicked again and again, clicking like the sound of her own heart, steady but deliberate. "This will make things easier," Rachel said, her voice low, but the satisfaction in it was undeniable. "You've got evidence now. Proof of everything they did." Marjorie nodded, her hand clenching into a fist at her side. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about everything, the lies, the manipulation, the years of enduring things she should never have had to. She pulled away from the cabinets and moved to the hallway. The damage was everywhere. It was as if Scott and Dana had turned the house into a symbol of their cruelty. A broken mirror lay on the floor in pieces, shards scattered like reminders of shattered promises. Sandra's voice cut through the silence like a calm wave. "This strengthens your restitution claims," she said, walking into the room with a steady, measured pace. "You'll have the full legal ground to pursue them now. Damages like these are considered part of the restitution process, and from what we're seeing, you're entitled to more than just a settlement." Marjorie turned to Sandra, meeting her eyes for the first time since the court ruling. There was no judgment, no condescension in Sandra's gaze, just calm determination. "You're right," Marjorie said, her voice steady, though the weight of it all felt like it was settling deeper into her bones. "This isn't just about the house. This is about what they did to me, what they think they can take without consequence." Rachel's camera flashed again, catching a corner of the broken countertop. Marjorie walked past her, fingers trailing along the edges of the cabinets as she stepped into the hallway. She paused in front of the closet door, seeing the slight dents in the wood from where it had been slammed too many times. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her attorney, an update on the next steps in the case. But before she could respond, the sound of a car door slamming outside made her freeze. Her pulse quickened. A voice rang out from the driveway. "You'll regret this, Marjorie." It was Dana. The shrillness of her tone was unmistakable, the venom clear in every word. Marjorie closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the anger settle before she moved to the window. She could see Donna standing in the front yard, hands on her hips, glaring at the house like she wanted to burn it to the ground. "Maybe you should be worried about your own regrets," Marjorie said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. She turned from the window and looked at Rachel and Sandra, her shoulders square with resolve. "I'm done letting them control me." "This ends now," Dana's voice screamed again from the yard, but Marjorie ignored it. She didn't need to engage in that fight anymore. The damage was done, and now it was her turn to take back everything she had lost. She'd filed the insurance claim, and with the evidence Rachel had gathered, everything was lining up in her favor. But it was more than just a legal battle now. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, everything they had tried to strip from her. She turned toward the door, her jaw set, ready for whatever came next. The house would be repaired. The court case would continue. And Scott and Dana, they would pay for every bit of damage they'd caused. But as she stepped forward, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The courtroom felt suffocating, the air thick with tension as the final day of the hearing began. Marjorie sat at the defendant's table, her back straight, her hands resting quietly on the table. It wasn't that she was calm, there was a storm inside her, an overwhelming urge to finally end the nightmare Scott and Dana had made of her life. But she had learned a long time ago that control was power. And today, control was everything. The room was filled with people, lawyers, clerks, spectators. And yet, for Marjorie, it felt like it was just her, Scott, and Dana. Scott, sitting across the room, appeared more nervous than ever, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for a way to escape the truth. Dana, seated beside him, was no less rattled, her arms crossed defensively, her eyes narrowed in a hard, angry line. Sandra sat next to Marjorie, her professionalism radiating from her like a shield, while Rachel stood a few feet behind, her camera slung over her shoulder, prepared for anything. Marjorie knew Rachel's testimony would be vital today. She had everything they needed: photographs, reports, and every detail carefully documented. The judge, a stern woman with a no-nonsense air, called the proceedings to order, her gavel echoing sharply through the silent room. "Miss Clark, you may present your evidence," the judge said, her gaze steady and unyielding. Marjorie stood, her movements deliberate, her heart beating like a drum in her chest. She walked up to the front, where the court clerk handed her a stack of evidence. As she laid the first photo down on the table, the room fell into a hush. It was an image of the shattered mirror, its broken shards scattered across the floor, reflecting pieces of what used to be. "I have photos documenting the damage to my property," Marjorie began, her voice calm but carrying with undeniable weight. "This is only a small part of what was done." With each photo she placed on the table, the reality of the destruction was brought to light: the broken cabinets, the holes in the drywall, the vandalized furniture. There was no mistaking it now. This was more than just wear and tear. This was deliberate. "Miss Clark," Sandra spoke up from behind her, "what we are seeing here is clear vandalism, intentional and malicious destruction of property. My client is seeking restitution for damages, as well as additional compensation for the emotional distress caused." Marjorie turned to face the judge, who was reviewing the photos with keen attention. The judge's face remained stoic, but Marjorie could tell she was processing the magnitude of what had been done. Rachel stepped forward then, and the room's attention shifted. She didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. Her quiet authority filled the space. "I took these photographs, Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice steady. "I documented the destruction as it occurred. The damage is extensive, and from my experience, this was not an accident. This was calculated. Every room bears evidence of force of anger." She gestured to the photos on the table, each one another indictment of Scott and Dana's actions. Scott shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting back and forth, clearly unsettled. When Rachel finished, he stood up, his face tight with frustration. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaking with forced confidence, "I never meant for this to happen. Dana." He paused, as if seeking permission to speak further, but the judge interrupted. "Mr. Clark, we are not here to shift blame," she said firmly. "The damages are clear, and your responsibility is not in question." "You will not deflect onto others." Scott's face flushed red, his hands clenched in fists at his sides. "But Dana, he stammered, but his voice faltered. Dana, who had been silent up until now, spoke for the first time, her voice sharp with disbelief. "This is insane. We didn't do that. Marjorie's just—" She stopped herself, realizing the futility of defending their actions. The judge held up her hand, silencing her with a simple gesture. "Enough, Ms. Clark, she said, turning back to the photos. The evidence speaks for itself. A deep silence filled the room as the judge glanced over the images once more. Marjorie's hands were clammy, but she kept her composure, her gaze unwavering. She was done being intimidated. She was done allowing Scott and Dana to rewrite the narrative. Today, the truth was hers to tell. The judge shifted in her seat, her eyes moving from the photos back to Scott and Dana. She addressed them directly, her voice sharp. Mr. and Miss Clark, based on the evidence presented today, I am ruling in favor of Mrs. Clark. You are hereby ordered to pay restitution for the damages caused to the property, including additional legal fees and compensation for emotional distress. Scott's face twisted with rage, but there was nothing he could do. The decision was final. Dana shot a desperate look at him, but he was already sinking back into his seat, defeated. Marjorie didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She had won. The judge's gavel came down with a resounding thud, the finality of it echoing in Marjorie's chest. Court adjourned, the judge announced. And just like that, the fight was over. Marjorie sat back down, her hands resting on the table, her eyes focused straight ahead. She wasn't smiling, but the weight that had been on her shoulders for so long was finally starting to lift. Scott and Dana might have thought they could break her, but today she had proven that she could break them. The moving truck idled at the curb, its engine humming faintly, a low growl in the quiet suburban street. The smell of diesel mixed with the faint scent of fresh-cut grass in the air. It was an ordinary scene, but today it was anything but. The crew, muscle-bound and quiet, worked efficiently, unloading the few belongings Scott and Dana had left behind, things they'd once believed were theirs to claim. A neighbor lingered by her fence, eyeing the scene with a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment. Another peeked out from behind her blinds, her expression filled with barely concealed gossip. The world felt silent as Marjorie stood by her front door, watching the final act of the drama unfold in her yard. She was calm, her posture relaxed but firm. The weight of the court's decision still buzzed in her veins, but now there was something different, satisfaction. It wasn't just the house she had regained, or the legal victory that had finally been hers to claim. It was this moment where Scott and Dana stood exposed, their world collapsing as they realized that all the lies, all the manipulation, had caught up with them. They were on the other side now. Scott stood on the sidewalk, his face a portrait of silent fury. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the workers moving his things, his former things, out of the house. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His glare was enough to say it all. There was nothing left for him here, not even a shred of dignity. Dana, on the other hand, was a mess. Her emotions were unraveling in front of anyone who could see. She was pacing back and forth, her hands twisting in the air as she shrieked. "You ruined us," she wailed, her voice high-pitched, full of panic and disbelief. She turned to face Marjorie, her expression a twisted mixture of anger and desperation. "You've taken everything from us." Marjorie watched her calmly, her gaze steady, unwavering. The scene unfolding before her was just another confirmation that she had made the right choice. The right choice to stand her ground, to no longer be the victim of their cruelty. "You ruined me first," Marjorie said quietly, but the words carried. There was no venom in her voice, no need to shout. Just simple, brutal truth. It felt like a release, like the final stitch in a wound that had been festering for years. Dana staggered back a step, as if Marjorie's words had physically struck her. But it was Scott's reaction that made Marjorie's heart beat just a little faster. He was silent, watching the entire scene with narrowed eyes. There was no shouting now, no more excuses. Just cold, calculating silence. He turned away for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides, and Marjorie almost wondered if he would explode. But then he just stayed silent. He had lost. His defeat was silent but heavy, and it was all around him. Rachel, standing a few feet behind Marjorie, folded her arms across her chest, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. She had seen this before, countless times. People on the wrong side of the law, the wrong side of justice, finally feeling the weight of what they had done. Her smile was the satisfaction of a job well done, of proof that standing by Marjorie had been the right call. She didn't need to say anything. The scene played out perfectly on its own. Dana's wails continued, but they fell on deaf ears. The workers were unbothered, focused on their task. They treated Scott and Dana's belongings with professional indifference, because they were professionals. This wasn't about them. This was just a job that had been mandated by law. As the last of their things were loaded onto the truck, Dana collapsed onto the grass, her sobs echoing in the air, though no one moved to comfort her. She was alone now, utterly exposed. Marjorie stepped forward, walking slowly toward the door, her steps deliberate. She glanced back at Scott, who stood motionless, watching her as if she were the one who had ruined his world. She could feel the intensity of his stare, but it didn't faze her. She was free. He was not. "Take them," she muttered under her breath. It wasn't for anyone to hear but herself. It was a simple declaration, a final, quiet exhale of a battle long fought. She had taken everything from him: the house, the power, the control. It was all hers now, and there was nothing left for him to claim. The truck rumbled to life, pulling away from the curb, Scott and Dana standing there, two broken figures in the front yard. Marjorie didn't look back. There was no need to. This chapter had ended, and the next one, her next chapter, was already unfolding. But as she stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that Scott wasn't finished. He might have lost today, but he was still dangerous. And the worst part? She had a feeling that the damage he would try to do next would be far worse than anything before. Marjorie didn't let herself think about it too long. There was no room for that kind of fear now. The door closed behind her, the sound of the latch echoing like the final nail in a coffin. The courtroom was stifling, the air thick with the hum of anticipation as Scott's latest move unfurled in front of everyone. Marjorie stood at the back, her arms crossed, a quiet strength in the face of yet another attempt to undo everything she had worked for. She had thought the worst was over, but Scott, always desperate, was trying one more time to claw his way back into her life and into what was rightfully hers. He stood, his figure slumped yet still defiant, leaning against the witness stand as his attorney presented his case. The familiar tightness in his face, the way his eyes flicked back to Marjorie as if he could will the truth to bend in his favor, she recognized it all too well. He was ready to play his last card, the one he had been waiting for. Rachel. "She was influencing her, Your Honor," Scott said, his voice now tinged with false conviction. "I wasn't aware of the manipulation happening, but I'm certain that Rachel, well, she's had an unhealthy influence over my wife, over everything. This decision, this disastrous ruling, was made under her influence. Marjorie wasn't thinking clearly. She didn't make these choices on her own." Rachel twisted everything. The words sliced through the air, an accusation, a desperate final attempt at control. The room went still, the murmurs of the onlookers quieting to a deathly hush. Marjorie felt her breath catch in her chest, the accusation hanging like a dark cloud over her. But she wouldn't flinch. She wouldn't show the tiniest crack of vulnerability. She had been through this before, and she was not about to let him win with lies. Sandra stood without hesitation, her posture stiff with the kind of professionalism that could not be shaken. She stepped forward and placed a document in front of the judge, her voice low but firm. "Your Honor, I have here the medical evaluation of Mrs. Clark, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that she is fully competent. There is no evidence that she was coerced, influenced, or manipulated in any way by anyone, let alone Ms. Richard." Sandra's eyes met Marjorie's for just a moment, a brief but powerful exchange of solidarity. The judge flipped through the pages quickly, her eyes scanning the findings with sharp precision. Marjorie could feel her own pulse quicken as she waited for the final word. But she didn't need to hear the judge's ruling to know what was coming. She had already won. Rachel's calm presence in the background was like the quiet hum of an impending storm. She had stood by Marjorie every step of the way, always present, always steady. And now her testimony would be the keystone that would crush Scott's final attempt at rewriting history. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice carrying the weight of the truth, "I am here not to manipulate, but to testify. What Scott is claiming is not only a lie, but an insult. I have acted as Marjorie's friend, her support, nothing more. The decisions she made were her own, and they were well within her legal right. There was no coercion, no manipulation, just truth." Scott's face contorted as if her words were daggers, each syllable a sharp reminder of his defeat. He stood motionless, eyes locked onto Rachel with a kind of silent rage, but there was nothing he could do now. His last attempt to tear them down had failed. The judge's voice rang out, cold and final. "The evidence presented is clear. Mrs. Clark's competence is well established. There is no substance to the claims that Miss Richards had any undue influence over her. This appeal is dismissed immediately." The finality of the ruling hit like a hammer, and the courtroom's tense atmosphere shifted, the weight of Scott's defeat settling heavily on him. His shoulders slumped as he sat back down, the last flicker of defiance draining from him. Dana, sitting next to him, had gone quiet, her eyes lowered, no longer daring to look at anyone. But Marjorie didn't spare them a second glance. Her victory was complete. And as for further harassment, the judge's eyes narrowed, her voice taking on a darker tone as she addressed Scott directly. "You will refrain from any further attempts to contact or interfere with Mrs. Clark. Any more actions like this, and you will be held in contempt of court. Consider this your final warning." Marjorie watched as Scott absorbed the words, his gaze flicking up to meet hers for a brief moment, but there was no power left in him now. His world had shattered, and he knew it. The facade he had built was crumbling, and it was entirely his own doing. Marjorie stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a cloak. She was finally free, and as she turned to leave, she knew that Scott's attempts to reclaim control had failed. She walked toward the door, her steps steady, her heart calm. Then she stopped, just as she reached the threshold, and without turning, she dropped the final line that would end everything. "Now crawl." The words hung in the air, a quiet echo of everything that had led her here. She didn't need to say more. The battle had been won, and the war, it was over. The door clicked shut behind her, and the sound felt like the closing of an era, the finality of a life rebuilt on her own terms. The morning sun cut through the kitchen window, casting long golden streaks across the table where Marjorie sat with her coffee. The paper unfolded in front of her. The headline leapt out at her, almost too surreal to grasp. "Widow reclaims home from exploitative son." The words seemed to pulse on the page, each one a victory, each one a testament to the battle she'd fought and won. The picture beneath the headline showed Marjorie standing on the porch, her arms slung around Rachel's shoulders, both women smiling with quiet pride. It was the kind of image that spoke of solidarity, of a life reclaimed. But Marjorie wasn't smiling today. She didn't need to. The truth had already been told. The story of her victory, her reclaiming of what was rightfully hers, was out there now, blaring from the front page for everyone to see. The headline, sharp and bold, was the kind of recognition Marjorie had never sought but had now earned. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and she stood slowly, setting the paper aside. She wasn't in the mood for visitors, but she couldn't ignore the rhythmic, persistent tapping that cut through the quiet house. She opened the door, finding her neighbor, Mrs. Fisher, standing there, her hands gripping the edges of the door frame like she was unsure of whether to step inside or not. The older woman peered around Marjorie's shoulder to the street, as if she expected someone else to be standing behind her. "I saw the paper," Mrs. Fisher said, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. You're the talk of the neighborhood." Marjorie met her gaze, her expression unreadable. She wasn't surprised. Of course the neighbors would be talking. What else was there to talk about? Scott and Dana's downfall had been inevitable. It was only a matter of time before the truth reached everyone's ears. "I didn't want to intrude," Mrs. Fisher continued, still standing in the doorway. "But you've made everyone proud, Marjorie. You're the strongest woman I know. People around here, they're all saying so. Your fight wasn't just about the house. It was about standing up to the kind of people that take advantage. You're an inspiration." Marjorie blinked, the words landing like soft stones in her chest. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to hear the words proud or inspiration from anyone. All she'd wanted was to get through this, to put the pieces of her life back together. Yet here they were, strangers, neighbors, admiring her strength in a way she had never thought possible. "Thank you," Marjorie said simply, her voice steady as she stepped back and let Mrs. Fisher pass. The woman's presence felt different now, somehow more aware of the strength Marjorie had hidden for so long. They weren't just exchanging pleasantries anymore. There was a shift. Marjorie had become a symbol, even in her own community, of someone who refused to back down. Back at the porch, the reporters had long gone, the headlines now printed and spread across the county. Scott's co-workers were gossiping over their coffee cups. Marjorie had heard the whispers from Rachel about how the news had made its way into their offices too. "The way they're talking," Rachel had said, a faint smirk curling her lips. "You'd think they were ashamed of their own. Word's gotten around about what Scott really is, and now everyone's whispering about it behind his back." Marjorie didn't need to hear their words, but knowing that Scott had to live with the consequences of his own actions brought her a quiet satisfaction. There was no more pretense, no more power plays, just his shame, growing in the shadows of his own life. It was a fitting punishment. Meanwhile, Dana had retreated to her online world, her social media feed now filled with crickets. She was too proud to admit her part in the collapse, but Marjorie could tell Dana wasn't showing her face anywhere, hiding behind profiles locked and silenced, trying to escape the heat. But Marjorie knew better. "The truth travels faster than they do," Marjorie muttered to herself, a bitter satisfaction curling in her chest. It was a strange thing, how the truth had a way of cutting through the noise, spreading farther and faster than anyone could anticipate. Scott and Dana had underestimated how quickly the world would turn on them, how quickly people would side with the one who stood firm. Marjorie sank into her armchair, the headline still hanging in the back of her mind. She hadn't asked for the limelight, but the light had found her all the same. She was no longer the woman hiding in the background, no longer the one who was afraid to speak. Now she was a woman whose voice was heard, whose actions were impossible to ignore. As she stared at the headline again, something stirred within her, a quiet resolve. She had closed the door on one chapter of her life, but the next had already begun. But the feeling that gnawed at her, that quiet unease in her gut, never quite left. The victory had been hers, but the truth was, there was always more to the story. And she knew with a sinking certainty that Scott and Dana would find a way to claw their way back into the story. This fight might be over, but there was always more waiting just around the corner. The knock on the door came just as Marjorie was about to pour herself another cup of coffee, the steam rising from the mug curling around her fingers like a comforting presence. She had just come from the porch, the last of the morning sunlight glinting off the freshly placed "sold" sign in the yard. It was a good day, a new beginning. She had reclaimed her home, her dignity, and her peace. But then, the knock. A steady, insistent rhythm that echoed through the quiet house, drawing her attention. She wasn't surprised. She'd been expecting this in some way. She knew Scott wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat quietly, even if it was deserved. With a soft exhale, Marjorie moved toward the door. Her pulse didn't quicken. There was no rush of adrenaline, no fear, just a quiet resolve. She was in control now. She had made her choice, and it was final. She opened the door. Scott was standing there, his face haggard, eyes bloodshot, his clothes wrinkled and disheveled, as if he had been on his feet for days. The last time she'd seen him, he was the man who used to stand tall, claiming his dominance over her life. But now he looked small, broken. "Mom, please?" His voice was low, cracking with desperation, a far cry from the confidence he had once exuded. "We've got nowhere. Where—" He paused, as if searching for the right words, but nothing came. Instead, his gaze dropped to the ground before flicking back up to hers, his eyes pleading. The words stung, even though she had been expecting them. She had no pity left for him. Not now. Not after everything he had put her through. Marjorie crossed her arms over her chest, standing tall in the doorway, her expression cold but not unkind. "You told me I looked pathetic," she said quietly, her voice steady, though there was an edge to it. "Look at yourself now." Scott flinched, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer, but his eyes flickered with a mix of shame and rage. He had expected to be met with sympathy, maybe even guilt. But Marjorie wasn't that woman anymore. She had been broken, but never again. Dana appeared behind him, her face twisted with fury. She stepped forward, hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're cruel," she spat, her voice rising with anger. "You think you can just throw us out like this? You're heartless." Marjorie didn't flinch. She didn't react. She wasn't going to let Dana's venom affect her. She had been cruel once. But this was justice. This was the reckoning that Scott and Dana had earned. Rachel, standing just behind Marjorie, folded her arms across her chest, her gaze unwavering as she watched the scene unfold. "No," Rachel said, her voice low and firm. "She's not cruel. She's fair." Scott's face twisted, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him like a physical blow. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to Dana, as if seeking some form of support from her, but she had nothing left to give. "Please?" His voice was quieter now, a faint crack of desperation in the words. "You can't do this. We need somewhere to go. We've lost everything. Don't—" Marjorie's heart didn't soften. It was hard, like stone, tempered by years of neglect and manipulation. She had nothing left for him but what was necessary, and that was nothing. "You had everything," she said coldly, her gaze steady. "You had a chance to be better, and you ruined it. I'm not your savior, Scott. You never let me be one." She paused, her words cutting through the air. "This is on you." Scott didn't respond. His mouth opened and closed, his hands shaking at his sides. But there was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. His world had crumbled, and it was his own fault. Dana stepped forward again, but Marjorie didn't flinch. "You're really going to stand there and watch us suffer?" Dana hissed, her voice full of venom. "After everything we did for you." Marjorie's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "After everything you did to me, you mean?" Dana's face twisted with rage, but Marjorie didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. Instead, she turned to Scott, whose head was bowed now, defeated, a shadow of the man he once was. With a final glance at the pair of them, Marjorie spoke, her voice low and final. "I've already made my choice," she said, her words clear. "And I'm not your fool anymore." She didn't wait for their response. She didn't need to. She stepped back into the house, her hand moving to close the door. Scott didn't try to stop her. Dana's muffled scream from the other side was just a faint echo as Marjorie closed the door softly, sealing herself away from the chaos. She leaned against the door for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence. Outside, Scott slumped down onto the front step, his back hunched as if the last breath had been knocked out of him. Dana stood behind him, her face twisted with defeat. But Marjorie didn't watch them. She had no reason to. She had taken her power back. She had won. And in the quiet that followed, Marjorie knew she was no longer the woman she had been. The truth had been laid bare, and Scott and Dana would have to live with the consequences. The office smelled like leather-bound books and fresh ink, a scent that had once filled Marjorie with a sense of dread, but now brought only calm. The oak desk was polished to a gleaming shine, its surface reflecting the soft afternoon light as she sat across from Sandra. Today, there was no hesitation, there was no fear. This moment had been a long time coming, and Marjorie was finally in control of everything, every decision, every part of her legacy. Sandra was just finishing the final touches, her fingers dancing over the keyboard, her sharp gaze flicking back to Marjorie with a look of quiet assurance. It was business now, decisions that had to be made, lines that had to be drawn. "I've updated everything," Sandra said, her voice smooth and confident. She slid the finalized documents over to Marjorie, who scanned the words with careful eyes. "Scott and Dana are permanently excluded from everything. This will stand as is. It's airtight." Marjorie didn't flinch. She didn't look back at the door or at the memories that had once clouded her decisions. The idea of Scott and Donna, her family, having any claim to what she had built, to what she had earned, felt impossible now. It was final. Her eyes lingered over the sections as Sandra spoke, the words becoming clearer with each glance. Exclusion of heirs, redistribution of assets. Rachel, her loyal friend, stood beside Marjorie as Sandra outlined the final changes. Rachel's name now held a place where Scott's once had, her hands steady as she grasped the weight of the moment. Marjorie took a breath, steadying herself, the words slipping from her mouth like an echo of truth. "I'm naming Rachel as my heir," she said, her voice sure. "She's been there when no one else was. She's the one who stood by me. My legacy, my inheritance, will go to the loyal, not the cruel." Sandra nodded, her eyes locked on Marjorie's, a brief moment of understanding passing between them. The trust, the will, it was all ironclad. The power was now where it belonged. "And," Marjorie's voice faltered, just for a moment, before she pushed forward, "a portion will go to a housing charity, to help people who need it, who deserve it." The weight of the words felt right, like a weight lifted. The charity wasn't just a place for donations. It was a reflection of what she had learned through the years of struggle and loss. Giving back was her way of turning the pain into something meaningful. Sandra clicked the final key on the keyboard, setting the documents to print. "This will hold up in court," she said. "It's airtight. Your decisions, your wishes, no one can challenge them now." Marjorie nodded slowly, feeling the satisfaction settle deep in her chest. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about reclaiming her future, her control over everything that had once been torn away. This was her choice now, and no one could take it from her. As the printer whirred to life, Sandra slid the papers toward Marjorie, each sheet a testament to the victory she had fought so hard for. Her hand reached for the documents, her fingers brushing against the smooth paper. As she picked them up, she felt something stir inside her, a final sense of clarity. She wasn't just leaving behind a legacy of wealth. She was leaving a legacy of strength, of defiance, of survival. "I'm done with them," she muttered to herself, the words a final punctuation to a chapter long overdue. She wouldn't look back, not anymore. Rachel stepped forward, her presence a quiet comfort, as she watched Marjorie sign the papers. She was a witness, yes, but more than that, she was a reminder that Marjorie hadn't been alone. Not in the darkest moments, and not now. Marjorie placed the pen down with a soft click, her hand steady as she passed the will back to Sandra for safekeeping. "Let them try," she said quietly, her voice filled with the kind of calm that only came after everything had been laid bare. "They can't touch this." Sandra smiled faintly, but there was no doubt in her eyes. She knew as well as Marjorie that the war was over. Marjorie stood up, feeling the strength in her legs. In her heart, she was no longer the woman who had been taken advantage of. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was in charge. She had built this life, this legacy. The door to Sandra's office clicked open, and the sound filled the room with a finality. Marjorie stepped through it, the weight of the documents heavy in her hand but light in her heart. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore. Not Scott's. Not Dana's. Her legacy was set. Her path was clear. And as she walked out into the light, she felt the burden of the past fall away. The future was hers, and no one would ever take it from her again. The house was quieter now, its once empty spaces filled with the sound of progress. Marjorie stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers grazing the newly polished granite, a satisfaction settling deep in her chest. It had been weeks since the legal battle had ended, and the change was palpable. She hadn't just reclaimed her home, she had reclaimed her life. Across the room, Rachel hummed softly, tapping the freshly painted woodwork with a brush. The transformation was happening before Marjorie's eyes. Every corner of the house was being renewed. Every faded surface revived. It was a labor of love, a reclamation of not just the house, but the future she was building for herself. The walls were coming alive with color, and for the first time in ages, Marjorie saw the space around her as something entirely new, something hers, completely. No longer haunted by the past, no longer stained by Scott and Dana's disregard for her. She glanced out the window at the freshly mowed lawn, a peaceful suburban scene unfolding before her. She didn't think of Scott or Dana anymore, not with anger or bitterness, but with the cold, detached certainty that their influence was over. Their legacy had been wiped clean by the restitution orders, their credit destroyed, their future obliterated by their own cruelty. When the court had ruled, it hadn't just taken their home from them. It had taken everything they'd built, everything they'd manipulated. The bank accounts drained, the rental evictions piling up. Scott and Dana had been exposed for who they were, greedy, exploitative, and ultimately powerless against the weight of justice. A soft knock on the door brought Marjorie back to the present. She wiped her hands on her apron before crossing the room. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Fisher, again. But this time, there was no need for pleasantries. She wasn't here to gossip. She had already seen the transformation, the way Marjorie had turned the house into something unrecognizable, something whole. Mrs. Fisher smiled knowingly. Neighbors were talking again, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I saw Scott and Dana yesterday. She hesitated, as if measuring her words. They're really struggling. No place to stay. Can't even rent an apartment. Marjorie said nothing. She simply nodded, allowing the words to sink in. She wasn't surprised. It had been inevitable. Dana and Scott had made their choices long ago, and now they were paying the price. Don't feel sorry for them, Marjorie said softly, her voice steady. They had a chance. They ruined it. Mrs. Fisher looked down at her hands, fidgeting with her scarf. I just want to say, I'm proud of you, Marjorie. You've shown us all what strength really is. Marjorie offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. Thank you. As Mrs. Fisher left, Marjorie glanced out the window again. She could see Rachel still working outside, the paintbrush making slow, deliberate strokes across the fence. There was something so grounding about it, about rebuilding, about starting from scratch, and knowing that this time, it was hers. A few moments later, Rachel stepped inside, wiping the sweat from her brow, her face flushed from the effort, but grinning like it was the most satisfying work in the world. Almost done, she said, pulling off her gloves. This place is going to look brand new when we're finished. Marjorie nodded, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. They thought I was pathetic. They crawl now, she thought to herself. The words seemed to linger, a reminder of how far she had come. You're a damn good friend, Rachel, she said, her voice full of gratitude, her eyes meeting Rachel's with a depth that spoke of shared strength. Rachel smirked, shaking her head as she tossed her gloves aside. No, Marjorie, she said, with a chuckle. I'm just the one who got to help you win. She paused for a moment, her gaze turning more serious. But you? You've rebuilt yourself. From the ground up, Marjorie didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, taking in the words, taking in everything. The past was over, the future was bright, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a shadow of the woman she once was. Just as she was about to speak, her phone buzzed on the countertop. She picked it up, glancing at the message. It was from Sandra. The message was brief, but it made her stomach tighten with a quiet satisfaction. Justice complete. It's over. Marjorie closed her eyes, the words sinking in. It was true. It was finally over. Scott and Dana were no longer a threat. They were nothing now, just shadows, crawling in their own failure. She put the phone down and turned back to Rachel, her heart light. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We've got work to do." And as they stood side by side, the future stretching out before them, Marjorie knew with certainty that she was done with being controlled, done with being the victim. She was finally the woman who controlled her own destiny, and nothing, no one, could take that away from her again. The scent of fresh paint lingered in the air, mixing with the comforting fragrance of wood polish and citrus cleaner. Marjorie stood in the middle of the living room, the walls surrounding her now gleaming in a warm shade of ivory. The transformation was complete. The room no longer felt like an echo of the past, but a reflection of her present. A new chapter with every brushstroke, every polish, every corner redefined. She dipped the brush into the paint, her strokes slow and deliberate, adding a layer of life to the walls. The sound of the bristles against the surface was oddly soothing, like a whisper of peace in a home that had once felt like a battlefield. Rachel was a few steps behind her, adjusting the newly hung curtains at the window, her movements graceful as she smoothed out the fabric. The light from outside streamed through, spilling across the room like a promise, filling the space with warmth. "You know," Rachel said, stepping back to admire her work, "I think this is the best we've done so far." Her voice carried a quiet satisfaction, her eyes meeting Marjorie's. "It feels like home." Marjorie stepped back, allowing herself a moment to appreciate the work they had done together. The house had come alive again, and with it, so had she. It wasn't just the paint or the new cabinets that lined the kitchen, or the curtains that now framed the windows. It was the feeling of ownership, of peace, of control. "This was always mine," Marjorie said quietly, her words carrying weight. She turned to face Rachel, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The words weren't a boast. They were a reminder of the battle she had fought and of the victory she had claimed. Rachel nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "And now it's safe," she replied, her voice thick with meaning. Marjorie's heart swelled at the simplicity of those words. Safe. The word was a balm, soothing the raw edges of her soul that had once been shredded by years of manipulation and neglect. Now there was nothing left to fear, no one to control her, no more lies. Just her, this house, and the life she had rebuilt from the ground up. She reached for the paint can again, adding the final strokes to the last wall. It felt right, like the final piece of a puzzle snapping into place. She took a deep breath, letting the smell of fresh paint and wood polish fill her lungs, grounding her in the present moment. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" Rachel asked softly, her eyes searching Marjorie's face. "I mean, from where you were to now." Marjorie paused, looking around the room. The kitchen cabinets, once warped and broken, now stood proud and sturdy. The furniture, the walls, everything had a new life. Everything had a new purpose. And for the first time in years, she saw it all clearly. She had fought for this. She had fought for her peace. "Every day," Marjorie said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She turned to Rachel, her gaze steady. "But I don't think I could have done it without you." Rachel's lips quirked into a smile, the corners of her eyes crinkling with affection. I think we make a pretty good team. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the kind of understanding that only comes from shared experience. The house hummed with the sound of their laughter, quiet but real. It wasn't the loud, chaotic kind of laughter from when things had been easier. No, this was the laughter that came after the struggle, after the tears, after the fight. Marjorie set the brush down on the drop cloth, finally stepping back to take in the finished room. It was beautiful, but it was more than that. It was hers, every inch of it. She walked to the window, her fingers brushing the fabric of the new curtains. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the lawn. She felt a gentle breeze from outside, carrying the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings. She had no need for approval, no need for validation from the people who had once held her down. This was her life now, and it was enough. The sound of Rachel's soft laughter broke the quiet, pulling Marjorie's attention back to her friend, who was standing by the newly finished wall, admiring their work. "Do you ever wonder what they're doing now?" Rachel asked, a mischievous glint in her eyes. She was referring to Scott and Dana, of course, still in the periphery of Marjorie's life, but not in control anymore. Their downfall had been swift, and it seemed fitting that the house, their world, had fallen apart just as swiftly. Marjorie paused, the faintest flicker of thought crossing her mind. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. She didn't need to wonder. She didn't need to waste another thought on them. They had no place in her life anymore. "No," she said with a small smile. "I don't wonder about them. I wonder about what comes next." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. "What comes next?" Marjorie's eyes sparkled with determination, the same strength that had carried her through the darkest moments. "The future," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence, and its mind to shape. They stood there for a long moment, side by side, the house alive with the evidence of their work. The past was over. The future was in their hands. And Marjorie, for the first time, had nothing left to fear. The porch swing creaked softly as it swayed in the gentle breeze, the rhythmic motion carrying a sense of calm over the space. Marjorie sat on the worn seat, Rachel beside her, both of them basking in the quiet of the evening. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the yard, and the house, her house, stood before them, sturdy and secure. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to drift away, settling into a place of peace. In Marjorie's hands was a framed copy of the deed. The glass shimmered in the light, but it wasn't just the frame that captured her attention. It was the paper itself, the weight of the words on it, the assurance it gave her every time she looked at it. This house, her sanctuary, was officially hers. No one could take it away from her. Beside her, sealed and neat, sat the binder with her updated will. The new life she had carved out was secure, her future set in stone, ready to withstand any challenge. Rachel shifted beside her, glancing at the framed deed with a knowing smile. "One signature changed it all," Marjorie said softly, her voice laced with a quiet satisfaction. She looked at the deed again, the full weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't just a house she'd taken back. It was her life, her power. Every decision, every moment of reclaiming what was hers had led to this, to the life she had built without fear of anyone else's control. Rachel nodded, her lips curving into a subtle, knowing smile. "And showed who's truly pathetic," she replied. The words stung in their accuracy, but they weren't a jab at anyone other than the people who had sought to undermine Marjorie's strength. Scott and Dana had never understood that their manipulation would backfire, that their cruelty would eventually be their undoing. Marjorie's smile was calm, serene. She wasn't the woman who had once stood behind, waiting for someone to give her permission to live her life. Now she was free, in a way she had never been before. As the wind rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, Marjorie's thoughts drifted back to the moment at the airport. The memory of Scott's cruel words, "Walk behind. Us, you look pathetic," still had the power to bring a sting to her chest. It had been a moment that had defined everything that came after. His words had been meant to crush her, to keep her in her place. But it had been the last time he would ever try to dominate her. With a deep breath, Marjorie spoke again, her voice steady but full of conviction. At the airport, my son said, "Walk behind us, you look pathetic," she said. Her eyes locked on Rachel's for a moment. "So I made him crawl when I took back the house." Rachel's smile softened, a deep understanding in her gaze. "And he'll always remember that," she said, the words quiet but full of meaning. Marjorie nodded, her fingers curling around the frame of the deed. It wasn't just about the house. It was about her dignity, her reclaiming of everything they had taken. They hadn't just underestimated her. They had underestimated her strength, her ability to fight for what was hers. And now she had won. The house, with its freshly painted walls and newly furnished rooms, felt alive with the possibility of the future. No longer was it a symbol of her past suffering. It was a reflection of her power. Every inch of it, from the polished countertops to the smooth floors, spoke of the choices she had made to rebuild, to rise above, and to walk into a future where she would never again be controlled by anyone. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Rachel asked, her tone thoughtful, a hint of concern hidden beneath her words. Marjorie didn't hesitate. She shook her head slowly, a serene certainty settling over her. "No," she said, her voice unwavering. "They've already shown who they are. They can't come back from that." As the night deepened and the world around them quieted, Marjorie let the silence settle between them, feeling its weight, its peace. This was her moment, her life, her victory. And for the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, wasn't wondering what might come next. The future was hers, and nothing could take that away.